Tonight, we have a special treat for you. We've been announcing Dr. Stephen Meyer. He is a famous speaker and author, and he leads this centers of faith and having to do with the reasoning and faith and all that. He's most familiar to us through YouTube and all that. He's married and 3 grown-up children, resides in Seattle. And so he's here with us. He'll be speaking tonight and tomorrow, 10 o'clock. And after that, Sunday, as a fellow believer and a follower of Jesus Christ, he will deliver the message for Sunday service. All 3 services he will be doing. He needs much prayer for that. But would you welcome Dr. Stephen Meyer?
The green button is on. It's awfully nice to be here with you all. Already had a nice introduction to the church with several conversations. I'm going to talk about some disturbing trends initially in my talk in our country. And I have to say, I've been made to feel more hopeful just by learning about all the amazing things that this church is doing. Planting churches in university campuses and in other countries, and your outreach to homeless people, and it's very encouraging. We hear so much in the news about disturbing things, but there's things happening under the radar of the news media as the church is at work, and your church is a wonderful example of that. Before I begin, too, I wanted to just tell a story. We're going to have a question and answer time afterwards, and I wanted to tell you a story about my first year as a student in England. I did my PhD work in Cambridge, England, and I had gone to a very small liberal arts college up in Washington State. And so when I arrived in Cambridge, I was pretty intimidated by the whole place. And there was an introductory seminar in my department about the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And fortunately, I had taken though I was a science major, I had taken one philosophy course on the philosopher Kant. And so as the visiting professor was giving this very detailed lecture about details of the work of Kant's philosophy, it was about a part of his philosophy that I had never studied. And so at a certain point in the lecture, I raised my hand, earnest and wet behind the ears, as the British perceive all American students, and I said, that's such an interesting thing you're saying. Where in Kant's writing does he say that? I've never read that in Kant's work. And there was this uncomfortable shuffling of feet, people looking sideways. And the professor obliged me, and he gave me a source. And so I thought that was the end of it. But then afterwards, I was taken aside by my British supervisor, who was a don of the old school. And he said, Meyer, he said, I know in the States you've learned that the only stupid question is the one you didn't ask. It's different here. And then he told me that, he said, everyone here is bluffing. And if you're to succeed, you must learn to bluff too. So if you have a question that reveals ignorance, come ask me privately, he said. So anyway, we will have a Q&A afterwards, but I wanted everyone to know that it will be in accord with American rules, okay? No questions will be deemed stupid or ignorant, okay? All right, I've got a little doodad up here, and I wanted to start on a bit of a sober note. This year, 2023, marks the 40th anniversary of a very famous talk that was given by the Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn. It's now known as his Men Have Forgotten God talk. And he, in this talk, told the story of his childhood in Russia soon after the Bolshevik Revolution had taken place. And the word was spreading through the countryside. And he said the older people kept telling him, these things have happened because men have forgotten God. And here's a quote from the talk. He says, while I was still a child, I recall hearing a number of older people offer the following explanation for the great disasters that had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. Now, we have a number of disasters befalling America. We have a near epidemic level of teen suicide. We have an anxiety epidemic in young people. We've had these mass shootings, the school shootings. We have family breakdown, children being born out of wedlock, confusion about gender, promiscuity, illegitimate, we could go on, abortion. People now, it used to be that people would defend abortion as the lesser of two evils. Now people will defend it as a positive moral good. And then of course, all the stories about the fentanyl coming over the border and the crime waves. It's distressing. And I would simply like to ask the question, is it possible that these disasters are befalling America because we have forgotten God? Now, there's a lot of polling data that's coming out about this. And last summer, there was a big headline that belief in God in the United States had dipped to a new low, still 81%, but a new low and a rather dramatic drop in just the last decade. This little chart shows that over the last 10 years, the belief in God had dropped by 10%, and that large drop was largely a result of younger people rejecting belief in God. The pollsters call this group, they have a term for it, they call it the rise of the nuns. They don't mean little ladies in habits, they mean people who are religiously unaffiliated or non-aligned. They don't have a stated religious belief. Now, some of those people might still privately believe in God, but belief in God, we know, is on the decline, even in the United States. Of course, it's been on the decline in Western Europe for quite a long time. Now, we decided to probe those results a bit more, and we've done some of our own, a survey of our own at Discovery Institute, the institute of which I'm a part. And we found that, our survey found that 65% of self-described atheists and 43% of agnostics believe that the findings of science make the existence of God less probable. We wanted to know, well, why is this happening? Why are people rejecting God? What are the factors that people cite as to their reasons for unbelief? And it turned out in a very large percentage of the cases that the perceived message of science was one of the key factors. We also found, well, we found just anecdotally, because of being out on the road, giving talks, doing interviews, I have repeatedly encountered parents who are very saddened by their children's loss of faith. And a couple years ago, I did an interview in Texas for a Socrates in the City event. Anyone know the media personality Eric Metaxas? And he does these Socrates in the City events. And while we were filming, I was on this side of the stage and he was on the other side. There was a young woman, stage left. I didn't see her, but Eric did. And then I met her later. But she was apparently weeping visibly during our conversation about new scientific evidence for the existence of God. She was actually the camera woman. But she was so moved by this discussion that the tears were just running down her face. She was almost sobbing. And she was so embarrassed that she later wrote the producer who hired her to do the filming with an explanation, which he in turn passed on to Eric and me. And this is what she said. She said, throughout my college career, professors would constantly lecture that based on the evidence they had provided, there should be no way that anyone in class could believe in God. They'd argue that the science was proven, and hence God was a myth. I was not equipped to present a valid opposition in debate. I was desperate to find a commonality between my beliefs and my scientific education, but she went on to say, but I could find none. Now, she didn't fully reject her faith, but she had planned to go on to graduate school in science and found she couldn't take the cognitive dissonance anymore. If science was opposed to faith in God and she believed, she couldn't bring the two together. And so she'd lived with this kind of dissonance. She couldn't reconcile these two ways of thinking. And when Eric and I began to talk about scientific evidence supporting belief in God, the tears just started to fall. Now, many young people don't even live in a state of cognitive dissonance. They have just and are beginning to relinquish their belief in God. And the polling data shows that. Now, it's not hard to imagine why this is happening. There are very prominent voices in our culture who have been telling us for quite some time that science, properly understood, undermines belief in God. It makes it intellectually untenable or implausible. And you might recognize some of those voices. Many of them published in the last 10 or 15 years within a genre of literary style that came to get its own name. It was called the New Atheism. And the message of the New Atheists was, again, that science and religious belief are incompatible. One of those monster bestseller books was The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. Another was Universe from Nothing by Lawrence Krauss, a physicist from, most recently, Arizona State. Dawkins, of course, is the famous Oxford biologist, evolutionary biologist. You had Stephen Hawking near the end of his life got into the act with a book called The Grand Design, which was arguing that there is no design to the universe. And of course, Bill Nye, the science guy, also had his crack at this. And the great Steven Weinberg, the tremendous physicist from the University of Texas, who just died about a year and a half ago, summer of 2021. And he was a great physicist and cosmologist, but was also known for a famous quotation where he said, "The more the universe seems comprehensible, meaning to our science, the more it seems pointless." And so these are the kind of voices that are resonating with our young people as they're going through university, and they get it through social media and everywhere else. So it's not hard to believe or hard to understand how people are getting the message that science makes belief in God much less likely, untenable, impossible, etc. Now, in our survey, we not only found that the perceived message of science or findings of science made belief in God untenable, but there were specific scientific theories that most contributed to this, and they were, in fact, theories of evolution, of undirected evolution. Chemical evolutionary theories about the origin of the first life, and biological evolutionary theories about the origin of new forms of life from simpler pre-existing forms. The latter type of evolutionary theories are roughly the Darwinian style of evolution, the Darwinian theories of evolution. Now, this is also not surprising because the Darwinian biologists themselves have explained the philosophical import of Darwinian theory. Stephen Jay Gould, the late and very great evolutionary biologist from Harvard University, said that Darwin developed an evolutionary theory based on chance variation and natural selection, and then he went on to characterize that as a rigidly materialistic and basically atheistic version of evolution. Now, Gould's clarification here, I think, is very interesting and significant, because what he's saying is that you might believe in evolution as a God-guided process, or you might believe that that there is a kind of hidden hand behind evolution, but that's not what Darwin had in mind, he's saying. Darwin was talking about a purely unguided, undirected process. It's not just a matter of change over time, it's an unguided process of change over time that has produced all the forms of life that we see today. And a theory that has that materialistic bent is going to naturally lead, as he puts it, in a basically atheistic direction. We can explain how everything got here without invoking a creator of any kind. That's why Richard Dawkins has also said that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. We can explain everything, all the forms of life we see on planet Earth, by reference to purely unguided, undirected processes. Now, this gives us a chance to clarify something that will be useful as we think about these issues throughout the weekend. And as Pastor mentioned, I'll be giving 3 talks, one tonight, one tomorrow, and one, well, I guess the same talk 3 times on Sunday. So how do you do that? That's and also, if you've looked at any of the announcements, I was going to talk about my first book, Signature in the Cell, but Pastor told me over dinner that there's the significant demographic of the church here includes people of an Asian background. And I have a talk about Darwin's theory of evolution that trades on a very interesting Chinese fossil find. So I changed my mind. I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. So it'll be a little different. I'm pandering to you all, but it seemed like I think you'll find it very interesting. It's also about intelligent design, but it talks about some really interesting developments that are coming out of China that are contributing to that debate. So anyway, let's talk just a little bit about the different meanings of the term evolution, because that'll help us as we think about these issues throughout the weekend. One meaning is the very innocuous meaning and non-controversial meaning, just the idea of change over time. And there's a couple senses of that. One is that the life on the planet today is different than it was a long time ago. So if we look at life today, we see crabs, we see dolphins, we see horses, we see various kinds of bird species that didn't exist back in the Cambrian period or in the Triassic period during the time of the dinosaurs. So there has been, if you look at the fossil record, you see that the composition of life on Earth is different now than it was a long time ago. That's a sense of change over time. There's also the idea of what's sometimes called microevolution, small-scale variation within the limits of a gene pool. So the most famous example of that is perhaps the finches, Darwin's finches, that have had different lengths or shapes of their beaks in response to different environmental condition, slightly different varieties of finches that have evolved in a very modest sense over an observable period of time. Or you might think of the famous moths, the peppered moths in England that changed their coloration from light to dark and back again in response to changes in the level of pollution. So that kind of small-scale variation in coloration or other superficial traits within the framework of a species or a genus is well documented. Nobody doubts that. And it's sometimes called evolution. It's called a microevolution, or it is a form of change over time. Now, another meaning of evolution is the idea of universal common descent, that all the organisms that we see on the planet today evolved or changed from one or very few simple forms a long time ago. Or if you think of the timeline in the other direction, if you think of those very few simple forms, they gradually morphed and changed and added new traits and characteristics, and eventually all the forms of life that we see arose from those simple forms through a process of continuous and connected change over a long period of time, such that we can represent the history of life, as Darwin did, as a great branching tree, where the base of the tree represents the simple one-celled organism, or organisms that were the progenitors of everything else. The branches on the tree represents the giraffes and the dolphins and the horses and all the things that we have around us today. So that's a second meaning. Now, that's a bit more controversial. I happen to be skeptical of universal common descent. Some of the things I'll talk about tomorrow will explain why. But there are proponents of the theory that I represent, the theory of intelligent design, who don't challenge universal common descent. That's not the major issue, nor the one that Stephen Jay Gould was talking about when he talked about the atheistic character of Darwinian evolution. There's a third meaning of evolution, though, that starts to get at this idea of undirected change. And it's the idea that the cause of change, the cause of all that change that we see in the history of life, from the first form to the forms we see today, is a product of a process known as natural selection, acting on random variations or a particular kind of variations that biologists talk about today called mutations. Now, this idea is very significant philosophically because it is affirming that the change is unguided and undirected. And to see why, I want to tell you a little story about sheep. This was in the 19th century. One of the best evidences of design or one of the most popular evidences of design was called adaptation. Biologists in the 19th century noticed that fish lived in the water, and they were well adapted to that environment. They had gills that could extract oxygen from the water. They had fins and flippers, and birds had wings, and they lived in the air. And every organism seemed to have the attributes and the capabilities that allowed it to thrive in the particular environment in which it lived. And so the 19th century biologists thought that evidence of adaptation, or the fitness of an organism to its environment, was a powerful argument that the organism had been designed to live in that environment. So they thought adaptation was a strong argument for design. Now, what Darwin did is he came along and he explained adaptation naturalistically. And so here's an illustration of how he did it. Let's imagine that you're a sheep herder in the far north of Scotland. That was my Scottish accent, just in case you were wondering. So you're in the far north of Scotland, and you want to breed a woollier breed of sheep. What do you do? Well, it was well known 19th century, actually all the way back to biblical times, that you could use a process of selective breeding. You could take the woolliest males and the woolliest ewes and pull them out from the herd and allow only those ones to breed. The rest of the sheep got no dates. And so you just allowed the woolliest male and females to breed, and then you get a slightly woollier group of offspring. Then out of that group, you'd pull the woolliest male and female and allow only them to breed. And you repeat this process over many, many generations, and eventually you'd get a very woolly breed of sheep, okay? That's maybe not quite as woolly as the ones in VeggieTales that just fell over, but very woolly sheep, okay? Now that was a process known as artificial selection. Why was it artificial? Well, because the breeder was choosing certain traits to maximize or amplify or optimize, okay? And so it was intelligently guided selection. But this is where Darwin came in. He said, well, what if instead of the breeder doing the selecting, what if, for example, up there in the far north of Scotland, there's a series of very cold winters so that all but the very woolliest of the sheep die off? And so only the woolliest ones can breed and pass on that woolly trait to the next generation. What's going to happen? Well, you get a slightly woollier group of offspring. And if that continues, say, over 20 generations, you're going to have a very woolly breed of sheep. And so now you get the same outcome. You get a very woolly breed of sheep in a very cold climate. So the sheep are well adapted to the environment, but the adaptation wasn't produced by an intelligent designer. It wasn't produced artificially by the breeder. It was produced by nature. Nature did it, the change in the environment. So that's the idea of natural selection, okay? And so natural selection is understood by the Darwinians to be a strictly natural process. It's not a God-guided process. The whole point of natural selection is you get rid of the breeder. You get rid of the intelligent guidance. And so this is what Gould is talking about. This third meaning of evolution is affirming a kind of undesigned process. And Darwin himself was quite explicit about this. He says, there seems to be no more design in the variability of organic beings and in the action of natural selection than in the course in which the wind blows. It's just nature doing its thing over a long period of time. Okay, do you feel the force of that argument? That's the Darwinian view. That's why people like Richard Dawkins say things like this. He says that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. What's the key word in that quotation? Appearance, right? It's the illusion of design. It's the illusion of design. Now, sneak preview, and this is a bit of a preview on tomorrow, it turns out there's a big question that biologists are asking today. And they're asking, well, is adaptation and the small-scale variation that's involved in producing adaptation the only evidence of design, or might there be other evidences of design? Another way to think of that is, does the evolutionary process only produce small-scale variations, or can it also explain the large-scale innovations in biological form that occur as documented in the fossil record? Does a nice job of explaining the finch beaks, but can explain the origin of birds? Can explain the little changes, but how about the big changes? And there's a very big discussion and debate going on right now in biology and evolutionary biology about that question, about how much creative power does the natural selection process actually possess. That's a little bit of a sneak preview because we'll get into that scientific issue tomorrow. But from the standpoint of understanding the philosophical implications, the worldview implications of Darwinism, it's important to understand that when we talk about Darwinian evolution, we're not just talking about change over time or about even common ancestry. We're talking about an unguided, undirected process that can produce the appearance of design, but not without itself being guided or directed in any way. So if we have our three meanings of evolution back here, evolution number 3 is the one that's affirmed by sort of the mainstream Darwinian establishment. And as Stephen Jay Gould said, that has materialistic or even atheistic implications. Let's talk a little bit about the philosophical implications of evolutionary theory, because the talk tonight is intelligent design, what it is and why it matters to our worldview and culture. How many people are familiar with the term worldview? Is that okay, excellent, excellent. I'm going to tell a story, but I'll probably tell it again in church because it's fun, okay? So if you come to church on Sunday, you'll probably hear the same story again. But when I was in college, when I was heading off to college, I had a conversation with my father. And he's a mechanical engineer, worked in aerospace. He's practical. He can fix things. He doesn't daydream. In other words, he's completely unlike me. And at least I thought so when I was younger. So when he'd be fixing the car, he wanted to teach me, so I'd be standing by, and he'd ask me to hand him a wrench, and I'd hand it to him, and invariably I'd drop it in the most inaccessible place in the engine, and he'd just get so I was not mechanical, and I knew I didn't want to be an engineer. And so he said, look, son, I know you're heading off to college. I know you don't want to be an engineer, but you don't have to be an engineer. You can major in whatever you want to. But let me just give you a piece of advice. Before you decide on a major, make sure you take 2 years of college math. Because if you don't have the math, you're going to be limited in what you can choose. I said, okay, yes, Dad. So I took the calculus, I took the differential equations, I got through the 2 years. But I was at a small liberal arts college, and after you spend that much time taking that much math, all you can major in is either physics or math. And physics is pretty close to engineering, and so I majored in physics. So I come home, but here was the rub. I was always interested in these philosophical questions, thus the daydreaming. And so after Christmas time of my junior year, I come home, and I'm having a nice vacation, and the grade slip comes from the college, and my dad intercepts it because we have this kind of Germanic work ethic thing in my family. And so we're sitting over dinner, and he pulls it out, and he starts reading the grades. And I had that term been taking a philosophy class because I always snuck across campus to take a philosophy class to complement the science because that was kind of what I was really interested in. And I was taking a course called atheistic existentialism. That was Nietzsche and Sartre and Camus and all those depressing European philosophers telling you that God was dead and life had no meaning. And the point of the class was to wallow in existential despair. And I was very good at it, and I got an A. So my dad is reading the grade slip, and he says, atheistic and he mispronounced it on purpose to make the point that it wasn't a real subject. And then he read the grade, and it was A. And then the next course on the list was theoretical mechanics, which was my most important physics class that semester. And he read the grade, and it was a disappointing B. And then he has kind of a long nose, and the glasses slid down the nose, and the eyeballs went to me, and he gave me this look that meant in our family, it's now time for offspring to give account of offspring's behavior. And so I got real defensive, and I said, Dad, look, I know these philosophy classes don't mean anything to you, but they're important too, because in philosophy you learn all about worldviews. And a worldview is just basically like a personal philosophy that everyone has, even if they don't know about it, and it's kind of their default way of thinking about the big questions. And everybody has a worldview, and if you don't understand other people's worldviews, you don't understand why they use the words they choose and where they're coming from. And he cuts me off, and he says, son, you don't need a worldview. You need a job. Now, that seemed really cruel at the time, but now I'm that guy with my kids. So, I kind of get it. But anyway, I kind of had a trick for a while, though. I got a job teaching philosophy. So, but anyway, worldviews are important, and there is a default worldview in our culture today. Among, let's call it the elite knowledge culture, the universities, the law schools, the courts, the permanent bureaucracy, the science laboratories, the media, the institutions in our culture that shape our view of reality are predominantly not friendly to belief in God, certainly not friendly to religious expression or Christianity. Instead, there is a default way of thinking, and that philosophy has a name, and Stephen Jay Gould kind of was hinting at it. The scholars call it materialism. So they also sometimes call it naturalism, the idea that nature is all there is and there's nothing beyond nature, as in this picture here. where we have the physical world represented by the mountains and the trees and the pendulum representing the laws of nature, and then materialism, there is no God. There's nothing beyond the material or natural world. And so just going back to the previous slide, and one way to think about materialism as a worldview is to think about the story it tells about reality. If you think of in the Gospel of John, it says, in the beginning was the Word. Or in Genesis, it says, in the beginning. There's an affirmation that the physical world is a created thing that came into existence a finite time ago. But materialism instead says, no, just as you Christians and Jews think that that God is eternal and self-existent and has always been here, the great I am that I am, we think that the physical universe has always been here. It's eternal and self-existent, and therefore it didn't need a creator. So the materialistic story goes something like this. From eternity past were the particles and the energy. And the particles and the energy arranged themselves to become more complex chemicals, and those chemicals arranged themselves to become the first living cells, and those cells then evolved by Darwinian processes to produce all the forms of life we see today. And one of those forms of life, namely human beings, conceived of the idea of God. Okay, do you see how this is a worldview now? This is because the most important question that every worldview has to answer is, what is the thing or the process of the entity from which everything else came? In Christian theism or Judeo-Christian theism, what's the answer to that question? What is the thing from which everything else came? God. In materialism, what's the thing from which everything else came? It's matter. It's the particles, the energy, okay? You see, you've got two diametrically opposed worldviews. And in the materialistic worldview, there is room for the idea of God, but not God as a reality. That's Freud. You remember him? He said, God did not create man. Man invented the idea of God, okay? So you have these competing worldviews in our culture, but one of them is dominating the university culture, the media, the law schools, the courts, the elite knowledge culture. Pastor told me there's a lot of people here with science background or advanced degrees, lawyers, doctors. I think I could have a show of hands, but I bet you recognize this from your experience in higher education. You know, there's a default way of thinking, and it's not necessarily friendly to theistic belief in God. Okay. So we have this dominant worldview. It's coming out of science, or at least it's coming from the perceived message of science, and that helps us to explain a little bit why we have young people losing faith, especially when they go off to university. Does that make sense? I have here, I like this slide, the three great prophets of scientific materialism. You have Darwin and Marx in the late 19th century. Darwin tells us where we came from. Marx has a materialistic view of the future, his dialectical materialism. It's a utopian view of the future. It's strictly materialistic in the sense that he thinks that material economic forces are driving everything. And then Freud comes along in the early 20th century, and he tells us what to do about our guilt, what to do about the human condition. Can you see how those three great advocates of scientific materialism would end up advancing a kind of comprehensive worldview? Those three figures answer the basic questions that Christianity and Judaism had always answered. Creation, where we came from, where we're going, eschatology, and what to do about our guilt. Creation, fall, redemption. It's all there, but in a materialistic form. Okay, that's where we are in the elite culture. This materialistic view has lots of implications. It tells us that God does not exist, obviously, that man arose gradually from lower animals by mindless, undirected processes, that human beings have no intrinsic value. We're not made in the image of God. We don't have special value because God has deemed us unique among his creation. Free will is an illusion because we're governed by strictly materialistic forces, external environment or neurophysiology, nature, nurture. Objective morality is also an illusion because there is no source for any objective standard that's implied in all moral propositions. Life has no ultimate purpose because there's no purposive creator behind the universe. And when we die, we rot. There can be no hope of an afterlife because the only thing that exists is matter, and when our matter decomposes, we're done. That's the worldview. Any of those propositions resonate with any people you know? Any leading thought figures? Richard Dawkins, Stephen Hawking, figures. So this is a way of thinking. Now, there's a famous proverb in the Bible. It says, as a man thinketh, so is he, or in some translations, so shall he act. And so this way of thinking is starting to percolate into the culture, and it helps us understand why these scientific issues that are important for forming worldview are so important to broader personal and cultural concerns. So let's just give a couple examples. We have this epidemic of suicide among young people. And we had a kind of poignant experience of this. We had a bereaved father call our office a few years ago. We had a popular film that came out. It was a theatrical release documentary called Expelled. And in the end of the program, Ben Stein, the famous comic and economist and polymath, was interviewing Richard Dawkins. And he got Dawkins to admit that he actually didn't know how life arose in the first place, how we got from chemicals in the prebiotic soup to the first cell. But so the father called us, and the problem was that his son had committed suicide. And the father was a military chaplain. His son had enlisted. He got out. He was going back to college, and he was being aggressively proselytized, not for Judaism or Christianity, but for atheism, by a biology professor who was a devotee of Richard Dawkins's books. And so he was urging religious students in particular to read The God Delusion. And Jesse Kilgore, the young man, started reading it, and after they found his body, they found the book under his bed, annotated, and you could see from the annotations the progression of his thought, that first he had questions he couldn't answer, challenges to his faith he couldn't answer. Eventually he started to doubt his faith, and then he started to doubt all the plans he had made on the basis of his faith about serving God with his life, and then he started to feel, you could see he was feeling increasingly hopeless, and then became convinced of Dawkins's larger atheistic, even nihilistic philosophy that life really doesn't have an ultimate purpose. Dawkins has been quoted as saying, the universe has exactly the properties we should expect if at bottom there is no purpose, no design, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Can you see why young people might be losing their sense of meaning and purpose and hope? This young person did. So that's just an outcome of a materialistic way of thinking. Young people and others losing their sense that life has an ultimate significance or meaning, that there's a purpose to human existence. Here's another example. There have been these school shootings, and we've had them going back to the Columbine case in 1999. The media rarely reports on this, but in the recent case in Buffalo, and all the way back to Columbine, there has very often been a very specific philosophical motivation that the school shooters will have articulated in some kind of manifesto or other, whether in social media or someplace else. And so the media always says, why are they doing these things? Well, many of these young people tell you. They're depressed, they're angry, they don't think that God exists. And in this case, in the Columbine case, the two young men, it's tragic, thought that they were helping natural selection get rid of the weak. And so this is a quote from Eric Harris. Natural selection, it's the best thing that ever happened to the earth, getting rid of all the stupid and weak organisms. It's all natural, yes. I mean, how tragic. He didn't know what he was, this is, he's 16 or 17? Do you think he ever really studied whether or not natural selection is the whole show or the whole explanation for life? Probably not. But somewhere he picked this up and acted it out. I could give lots of examples. I mean, the whole debate about the sanctity of life in this country. If you think of a human fetus as nothing but a lump of tissue, well, it's going to seem morally innocuous to you to abort such. Abortion seems morally justified. We even have people justifying now infanticide. A different view, if you have a theistic worldview and you see humans made in the image of God, you might see an intrinsic dignity in that young person developing in utero. Diametrically opposed worldviews lead to diametrically opposed actions. As a man thinketh, so shall he act. So is he in his heart. So what's all this got to do with the topic of the evening, intelligent design? I've been talking so far about why Darwinism matters, because Darwinism has given rise to a broadly materialistic worldview. And that materialistic worldview, and here, this is a diagram we use to kind of illustrate this. Darwin, Marx, Freud, the three great 19th century, early 20th century thinkers justify a worldview called materialism. If you adopt that worldview, that personal philosophy, it's going to have an impact on your thinking about morality, about the sanctity of life, about whether or not you have free will and personal responsibility, and so forth. But what if Darwin's theory of origins isn't true? Might that have any different implications? Well, if you're a theist and you found this part of the talk a little depressing, I have some good news. And that is that the central proposition of Darwinism is now being challenged by cutting-edge findings in biology. Remember, we said the key proposition of Darwinian evolution is the idea that life is the product of an unguided, undirected process such that there's no evidence of actual design in nature, only the illusion or the appearance of design. So I just want to give you a little taste of some of the things that have been discovered that are suggesting not just the illusion of design or the appearance of design, but evidence of actual design. Some of you may be familiar with this. This is an animation still of a little tiny machine that's been discovered in the membrane of a bacterial cell. It's called a bacterial flagellar motor. You can see if you look at the screen, you'll see that there's a rotor and a stator and some bushings and a drive shaft and a U-joint, and that there's a little thing coming out the U-joint, and if you could see more, you'd see that it's a whip-like tail that functions like a propeller. What this is one of a number of miniature nanoscale machines that have been discovered inside one-celled organisms or inside other cells in our bodies. And it turns out that this isn't the only such miniature machine. There are many of them. This is literally a rotary engine. It turns in some species at 100,000 RPM in one direction, can change direction on a quarter of a turn. It's hardwired into something called a signal transduction circuit that gets information from the surrounding aqueous environment in which the bacterium lives, and the bacterium will get that information and then change its direction. So this thing is spinning like this, and it'll move the bacterium here, there, and everywhere to chase down its food supply. I'd like to call this high-tech and low life. Okay, it's awesome. In Darwin's time, no one had any idea about the existence of such machines. But if you go on on our websites at Discovery, I have a website, darwinsdoubt.com. It's got a whole playlist of animations of these miniature machines. They're little turbines called ATP synthase that build the ATP molecules that store the energy, that drive all of our metabolic processes. There's sliding clamps that are involved in DNA replication. There's little robotic walking motor proteins that pull vesicles of material along. Essentially, they're called tubulin proteins, but they're essentially railroad tracks. And there's a whole system of transportation of materials from one place in the cell to other places where they're needed to build yet other things. The cell is a complex factory with nanomachinery. It's mind-bogglingly complex. Now, of course, if you're a true blue Darwinian, you'll say, well, yeah, that's the appearance of design. But there's a problem with that argument. Because remember that natural selection was the mechanism that could produce, that has the creative power. Well, Michael Behe and others who have worked on these types of machines say that Darwinian explanation doesn't work because in this case of the bacterial flagellum, it has this set of 30 protein parts. And they've done what are called gene knockout experiments where you knock out one of the genes to stop it from functioning so it doesn't produce the part. The parts are all made of proteins. So the 29-part version of the machine doesn't work. The 28-part version doesn't work. The 27-part version doesn't work. Only the 30-part version works. Now, why is that a problem for Darwinian evolution? Well, it's a problem because natural selection, quote unquote, selects for functional advantage. If there's a trait that an organism has that allows it to win a competition for survival, that trait will be passed on to the next generation. But if the trait has no function, then there's nothing there to be selected or preserved and passed on. So in the case of the flagellar motor, if you have the 29-part version, or the 15-part version, whatever, until you get to 30 parts, you don't have a function that can be preserved and passed on. So natural selection can't help you until you have the whole motor. But that means you can't build it up gradually in a Darwinian fashion, one part at a time, which means natural selection is not going to help you with this. So Michael Behe's argued, well, natural selection is a kind of designer substitute. Remember our illustration from before of nature doing the selecting, not the breeder. But if natural selection, which is the designer substitute, can't really design machines like this, then maybe these machines aren't just giving evidence of the appearance of design. Maybe they're giving evidence of actual design, intelligent design. It's a pretty good argument. There's been counter-arguments, and we can address those in the Q&A if you know about them. They're good responses as well. But this is the kind of thing that's being discovered in biology, is little tiny miniature machines. But there's an even deeper consideration that I think leads to the conclusion of intelligent design in biology. This it's called a hook protein, is essentially a universal joint. And it's just one of those parts from the motor. Now we're going to kind of amplify it. And you see that it's got subunits that are labeled with letters. And those represent the amino acids. You may know that proteins are made of smaller subunits called amino acids. So the motor's made of proteins. The proteins are made of amino acids. There are 20 different kinds of protein-forming amino acids. And to get the chain of amino acids to fold into a specific shape that will do a job in a molecular motor or in the cell, the amino acids have to be arranged just right. And that raises a question. Well, how do they know to get arranged just right? To be sequenced properly so they fold up into the right kind of a shape? Well, it turns out there's another molecule in the cell that contains instructions for building those proteins. And that molecule, of course, is the famous molecule of deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. Now, the structure of DNA was elucidated by Watson and Crick in 1953. Famous story, wonderful story of scientific discovery. There were hints in their original scientific paper that they understood that DNA, because of its structure, might have the capacity to store instructions in something like a digital or alphabetic or typographic form. But an even more, I think, exciting discovery came in 1958 when Watson and Crick, well, actually it was Francis Crick, working on his own, formulated something called the sequence hypothesis. Can you see from the screen that this is what's called a structural formula of DNA? It's on the sides, there are these pentagons and sugars. You can see that? That forms what's known as the sugar phosphate backbone of the DNA. And on each side of the molecule, you have that. The sugar phosphate backbone has no information in it. It's just the medium in which the information is stored. But along the interior of that DNA, do you see that those subunits are labeled with letters? A, T, G, and C. Now, if you were able to look small enough, you wouldn't see the letters. But the point is, and this was Crick's idea, that those different subunits, each one has a slightly different chemical structure. Each one of those slightly different subunits is functioning like a letter in an alphabetic text. And this was his idea, what's known as the sequence hypothesis, that the arrangement of the DNA, and that last slide was a little off, sorry, the arrangement of those subunits in the DNA are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written language, or like the zeros and ones in a section of software, which is to say it's not their physical properties that gives them importance or a function in the cell, it's their arrangement in accord with a code that we later discovered called the genetic code. So you have a genetic text and a genetic code, and that information, Crick suggested, is what is building those miniature machines in cells and the proteins out of which they're made. Now, that sequence hypothesis was eventually confirmed by about 1965, and it's one of the great episodes in the history of science. Let me give you an example. I'm from Seattle. We have some famous companies up there, Microsoft, Boeing. They're both information companies, as it turns out. At Boeing, they use a technology called CAD/CAM, Computer-Assisted Design and Engineering. Any engineers here that would be familiar with that? Probably so, okay? Now, if there's so imagine you're at Boeing, you want to build an airplane, wing, for example. The engineer's sitting at a console, he writes some code, sends the code down the wire. The code is translated into a machine language that can be read at a manufacturing apparatus, and then that information will direct the manufacturing apparatus to place the rivets on the airplane wing in exactly the right places in accord with the engineer's specifications. So you have digital information directing the construction of a mechanical system. That's what's happening inside cells. Digital code in DNA is directing the construction of proteins and protein machines. That's a fascinating, mind-blowing discovery. For 2000, nobody knew this until the 1960s. Now that raises a huge question, though. We now know that DNA contains information. We know what that information does, but it raises an unanswered question, at least in the field of evolutionary biology. Anyone? Play Ben Stein here. Anyone? Where did the information come from? And the answer to that in evolutionary biology today is nobody knows. Especially if we're talking about the information necessary to build the first life. You know, if you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? Code, right? Code, information. Same thing turns out to be true in life. If you want to build a cell from simpler chemicals, you've got to provide information to arrange the chemicals to make the parts of the cell. If you want to build a new form of life from a simpler pre-existing form, you've got to have information to build the new organs and tissues. Biology is run every bit as much as in our computer world, it's run by information. What do we know about the origin of information in our computer domain? Bill Gates has said that DNA is like a computer program, but far more advanced than any software we've ever created. Where does software come from? A programmer! In fact, whenever we see information, especially if we find it in a digital or alphabetic form, and we trace that information back to its source, whether we're talking about a hieroglyphic inscription, or a paragraph in a book, or digital information transmitted through a radio signal, if we trace that information back to its source, we get to a writer or a scribe or a broadcaster. We always come to a mind or a programmer. So the discovery of information in a digital form at the foundation of life suggests that there was an intelligent agent involved in the origin of that life. Let me put it just slightly differently. In our uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning, information always comes from a mind. So if we apply what we know about cause and effect from our uniform and repeated experience, we should conclude that the information we find in living systems, like all other forms of digital or typographic information, has come from a mind. This is a very strong argument, not for apparent design, but for actual design. Early scientists who was applying information theory and informational concepts to analyzing molecular biology said the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. Hieroglyphic inscription, paragraph in a book, and this is the argument that I made in my first book called Signature in the Cell, that the information that we're discovering in life is providing powerful evidence for actual intelligent design. And so this brings us to what we call the formal theory of intelligent design, which is, in a sense, contrasting with evolution meaning number 3. Remember that? Just a few minutes ago we talked about evolution as an unguided, undirected process that produces the appearance but not the reality of design. The theory of intelligent design is not challenging evolution number 1, change over time, or even evolution number 2, common ancestry, but it is challenging the idea that the only kind of design we see in nature is apparent or illusory, not real. The digital code is not something that's been explained by any undirected, unguided process, and therefore, what we know from our uniform and repeated experience should provide us with it provides us with a very strong grounds for affirming actual design. So the theory of intelligent design simply says this, that there are key features of living systems and also the universe that can be best explained by the activity of a designing intelligence, not an undirected natural process, such as natural selection, acting on random mutations. In other words, living systems are look designed because they actually are designed. We've got the miniature machines, we've got the circuitry, we've got the digital code, we've got the nanotechnology that provides the evidence for this conclusion. Now, if the design we had in biology was the only design we have, we might say, as some leading scientists have proposed, that maybe life was designed not by God, but by some other agent within the cosmos. In the interview I mentioned where Richard Dawkins was talking to Ben Stein in the film Expelled, Richard Dawkins actually floated the idea that, well, maybe life was designed by an intelligent agent on another planet and then was seeded here on Earth. Francis Crick was so struck with the difficulty of explaining the origin of the first cell from simple chemistry on Earth that he also proposed a space alien designer as a hypothesis. It had a name for a while. It was called the idea of panspermia. He was so ridiculed by some of his colleagues, he decided he would never propose another theory about the origin of life again. He said it was almost a miracle. But it's at least logically possible if life arises on Earth some long, long time after the beginning of the universe, that maybe there was a pre-existing intelligent agent within the cosmos that created life and then sent it to Earth. So if all we had was the biology, we might have to entertain that as a logical possibility. But it turns out there's other evidences that I think move us in a decidedly theistic direction. I'm just going to touch on this. I'll talk much more about this on Sunday in when I'm the supply preacher. And that is that in physics, there's another evidence of design that physicists have been talking about since the 1960s, maybe even a bit earlier. It's called the so-called fine-tuning evidence. It's the idea that the basic parameters of physics, the strength of gravitational force, the strength of electromagnetic attraction, the masses of the elementary particles, the electrons and the protons and the quarks and so forth, the speed of light, these basic fundamental parameters of the universe are very finely tuned. They fall within narrow tolerances, such as if those forces were a bit stronger or weaker, if the elementary particles were a bit heavier or lighter, if the speed of light were faster or slower, if the universe were expanding faster or slower, if any of these things were a hair's breadth difference, then life would not be possible in the universe. In fact, in many cases, we couldn't even get basic chemistry off the ground. And the physicists have been blown away by this because the probability of getting some of these parameters, just one of these, there's a parameter, for example, called the cosmological constant. And the probability of getting that right, that's the force that causes the expansion of the universe outward from the Big Bang. And the probability of getting it right is 1 chance in 10 to the 90th power. To put that in perspective, it would be like floating around blindfolded in space and being asked to identify one marked elementary particle in our entire universe, but not just in our universe, but in 10 billion universes our size. So you pick at random, your chances of getting it right are 1 in 10 to the 90th if you're looking for 1 out of 10 billion universes. One particle, like a quark or an electron. That's the odds of getting the cosmological constant fine-tuned right. If it's a little bit stronger, we get a heat death of the universe. A little bit weaker, we get a big crunch, a big black hole. In either case, no life. So the physicists have just been very impressed with this evidence. And there are many attempts to explain it, but one of the great physicists of the 20th century who had been an ardent scientific materialist, an atheist, was a man named Fred Hoyle. And he discovered many of these fine-tuning parameters and changed his worldview. And he was later quoted as saying a common sense interpretation of the fine-tuning data suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as chemistry and biology. In other words, fine-tuning suggests a cosmic fine-tuner, also known as God. And since the fine-tuning was set from the very beginning of the universe, the space alien designer hypothesis won't work. Clearly, no being within the cosmos could be responsible for the fine-tuning of the universe as a whole that makes its very existence later possible. That would be getting the cart before the horse, or the effect before the cause, okay? So we have other evidence of design, in addition to the evidence in biology, that suggests that we're talking about a theistic designer. What I would say is that the theory of intelligent design and the evidence that supports it it's important because it challenges the dominant materialistic worldview and narrative that's part of our knowledge culture. And it also provides support for a theistic worldview, for the worldview affirmed by the Bible, that there is a transcendent creator who is also active in the creation. Now, on Sunday, I'll talk a bit more about another category of evidence, the evidence that we have from astronomy, suggesting that the universe itself had a beginning, that there was, in fact, a creation event. And I'll show some animation that will I'll show a little now to whet your appetite, but what scientists have discovered is that the universe is expanding outward from a kind of beginning point, a creation event. And so on the basis of these things, there are serious scientists and historians of science who are now saying that the idea that God created the universe is a more respectable hypothesis today than at any time in the last 100 years. And if you come Sunday, I'll explain why I think that's actually understating the case. That what I call the God hypothesis provides the best explanation for a whole range of evidence we have about biological and cosmological origins, about the origin of life and the origin and structure of the universe itself. And so why does that matter? Well, there's a famous theologian from about 100 years ago, J. Gresham Machen from Princeton Theological Seminary, who said that false ideas are one of the great obstacles to the gospel. We will succeed only in winning a straggler here and there if we permit the whole collective thought of the nation to be controlled by false ideas which, by the force of logic, prevent Christianity from being regarded as anything more than a harmless delusion. We saw that the materialistic thought form, worldview, philosophy has deleterious, adverse, bad consequences for our culture. What would happen if the culture started to be rebuilt based on what St. Paul has called the knowledge of God? What would that tree look like? If we had roots that affirmed evidence of the reality of a creator, would we perhaps get different fruit on the tree? Would our culture look differently if we recovered the knowledge of God? If we ceased to forget him, to reverse the Solzhenitsyn concern? Even people who believe in God, I think in our culture, forget God. I have to confess that I do every day. What if we remembered him more? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Maybe we'd have more wisdom in approaching these various challenges that our culture is facing today. And that's why the theory of intelligent design and other developments in science that are pointing in a theistic direction matter. And I'll stop there.